Beatrice Holloway didn't wait for the train to stop. She planted herself at the edge of the platform. Silk dress, chin up, hands folded like a judge at a sentencing. And when the doors opened and Clara Whitmore stepped down into the light of Blackridge Valley for the first time, Beatrice looked her over the way a person looks at something they've already decided to throw away. "Well," she said, loud enough that the men by the water trough could hear her, loud enough that the stationmaster's wife pressed her lips together and looked at the ground. "That's what $50 and a letter buys you these days." Nobody laughed. But nobody said a word either. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens to Clara next. It's going to be a long ride, and worth every mile. The train had been 3 days late. Clara Whitmore had spent those 3 days in a hard wooden seat, with her suitcase wedged between her feet and a photograph folded inside her coat pocket, close to her ribs. She'd taken it out so many times the crease down the middle had gone white. The man in the photograph was not handsome in any conventional way. He had a square jaw and tired eyes, and he was squinting at the camera like the sun was giving him trouble. Someone, his ranch hand maybe, had written on the back in pencil, "Ethan Callahan, Larimer County. He's a decent man." She'd read that line probably 40 times. She needed it to be true. At 28, Clara had learned the particular loneliness of being a woman who doesn't quite fit the spaces people try to put her in. She'd grown up in a boarding house in Pennsylvania, daughter of a woman who took in laundry and died of a fever when Clara was 16. After that, she'd worked seamstress, cook, schoolroom assistant for 3 years until the town hired someone younger with a proper teacher's certificate and a father with a name people recognized. She'd been engaged once to a hardware merchant named Douglas, who told her 6 weeks before their wedding that his family didn't think she had the right kind of background. She'd never asked him what that meant. She already knew. So when she saw the notice in the back pages of the Pittsburgh Courier, rancher, 34, seeks capable woman of good character, interested in frontier life, correspondence welcomed, she didn't tell herself it was romantic. She told herself it was a door, possibly the last one that would open before she stopped looking for them. She wrote. He wrote back. 12 letters over 4 months, careful and honest on both sides. He told her the ranch was unfinished. He told her winters were hard. He told her he wasn't a man who knew how to say the right thing at the right moment, but that he would try to be fair. She told him she wasn't fragile, that she'd been taking care of herself for a long time, and that she didn't expect a fairy tale. She just expected to be treated like a person. He wrote back, "That's something I can promise." She'd packed her suitcase the following week. Now she stood on the platform at Blackridge Valley while Beatrice Holloway's words settled over the small crowd like a smell. And Clara did what she'd learned to do in moments like this. She breathed. She kept her face still. She picked up her suitcase. The station master, a round man with a red nose and a sympathetic expression he wasn't brave enough to show openly, stepped forward to take her ticket stub. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you need somebody to take you out to the Callahan place?" "I can manage," she said. She didn't know if that was true, but she said it anyway. Beatrice was still standing at the edge of the platform, not pretending to be anywhere else. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pinned so tightly it pulled the skin at her temples, and eyes the color of creek water in winter, pale and absolutely unreadable. Beside her stood 2 women who seemed to exist primarily to be standing beside her, their expressions shifting to match hers with the practiced ease of long habit. "You'll want to speak with Reverend Hughes about the arrangements," Beatrice said, as if Clara had asked her something. "We do things properly here." Clara looked at her. Not the quick look of a woman trying to avoid a fight. A real look, the kind that takes in the full picture. "Thank you," she said, and she walked past. She heard one of the flanking women suck in a breath. She didn't turn around. The wagon Ethan had sent was driven by a boy of maybe 15 with freckles across his nose and a nervous energy that expressed itself in the way he handled the reins. Too tight, then too loose, then adjusting again for no particular reason. "He wanted to come himself," the boy said. "Mr. Callahan. But there was a situation with the east fence. 2 steers got out, and he's been—" He stopped, started again. "He wanted me to say he's sorry." "What's your name?" Clara asked. "Jesse. I work the morning shift, and sometimes afternoons when Pete's got his back trouble." He glanced sideways at her bag. "You want me to put that in the back?" "I've got it." Jesse nodded, looked forward at the road. After a moment he said, "Mrs. Holloway was there, wasn't she, at the station?" It wasn't really a question. "She was," Clara said. "She's like that with everyone she doesn't already know," Jesse said. He said it carefully, like he was trying to be fair, and Clara could see it was genuine. He wasn't trying to comfort her. He was trying to tell her something true. "She runs most of the town council through her husband, and her husband does whatever she says, so—" He shrugged. "People kind of just go along." "Do you?" Clara asked. Jesse thought about it. "I'm 15, he said. "I don't run anything." Clara almost smiled. Smart answer. The road out to the Callahan place was 5 miles of packed dirt and dry grass, and the land opened up around them in a way that Clara hadn't expected, wide and undecorated and enormous. She'd grown up in a city of narrow streets and brick walls close on all sides, and this much sky felt almost aggressive, like it was asking her something she hadn't prepared an answer for. But it was also, she thought, honest. Whatever this land was, it didn't pretend to be something else. That counted for something. The ranch came into view in pieces. First the fence line, then the outline of a barn against the flat horizon, then a cluster of low structures arranged in a rough square around a bare dirt yard. 2 men were working near the barn, and one of them looked up when the wagon came down the road. He put down what he was holding and walked toward them. He looked like the photograph, but different in the way all photographs are different from the real thing. Taller than she'd imagined. He moved with a deliberate kind of economy, like a man who'd learned not to waste effort. He had the same square jaw, the same tired eyes, and now that she could see them without the squint, they were a particular shade of gray-green, and they were looking at her not with evaluation, but with something closer to relief, which was the last thing she'd expected. He came to the wagon and said, "Miss Whitmore?" "Mr. Callahan." Jesse was already jumping down, finding somewhere else to be with the professional efficiency of a teenager who understood when his presence was not required. Ethan reached up to help her down. His hand was calloused and dry. When her feet touched the ground, he didn't let go of her hand for a second longer than necessary, and that second felt like something. She couldn't have said what exactly, but she noticed it. "I'm sorry I wasn't at the station," he said. "Fence situation." Your boy explained. "Jesse's a good kid." He glanced at her suitcase. "You want to see the house first, or do you want to walk the property?" She blinked. "You're asking which I'd prefer? You made a long trip. You might want to know what you've come to." Nobody had phrased it quite like that before, as something that might require knowing, rather than accepting. She looked at him for a moment. "House first," she said. "Then the property." He nodded. "House it is." The house was small. 2 rooms and a loft, rough-hewn lumber that had weathered to the color of driftwood, a stone fireplace with a crooked mantel, floors that were flat but not smooth. There was a table big enough for 4, 2 mismatched chairs, and a shelf on the wall with 3 books and a tin coffee pot. The windows had glass, which she understood was not nothing in a place like this. Someone had put a piece of blue cloth over one of the windows in lieu of a curtain. It was not even hemmed, just folded over the rod and tucked under. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked around. Ethan was in the doorway. "I know it's not much." "It's real," she said. He seemed uncertain how to take that. "I mean that as a compliment," she said. "The letter was real. This is real. I've been in places that looked better and were rotten underneath." She set her suitcase down against the wall. "I can work with real." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "The last woman who saw it said she couldn't live like this and left on the next available stage." She looked at him. "When was that?" 2 years ago." "What happened?" He shrugged, but it was a deliberate shrug, the kind that covers something. "She wasn't wrong. It was rougher then, still rough now." "Were you matched through the same agency?" "No, that was someone else entirely. Different situation." He paused. "I'm not telling you this to warn you off. I just thought you should know I've made mistakes in judgment before. Clara studied him, the tired eyes, the careful honesty. So have I, she said. He almost smiled. It was a small, tight thing, and it rearranged his face in a way that made him look, just briefly, younger. Well, he said, I'll show you where the water pump is, Ian. The next 4 days were a negotiation without language. Clara woke before dawn on the first morning and went to the kitchen, if you could call it that, more of a cooking corner, and built a fire and made coffee. Ethan came in an hour later, found the coffee already on, and said nothing except thank you, in a voice still rough from sleep. She spent the first day learning the rhythms of the ranch, watching more than doing, asking questions of Jesse and the other hand, a quiet Mexican man named Rodrigo, who had been with Ethan for 3 years and assessed Clara with the serious eyes of someone who had seen a lot of people come and go. He didn't talk much, but on the second day he showed her which of the chickens laid in the afternoon instead of the morning, and which gate latch had to be lifted and twisted, or it would stick. Small things. But small things were how trust started. She didn't try to be useful all at once. She'd learned that was the wrong approach. Come in performing competence, and people got defensive. Instead, she watched, helped where help was obviously needed, and let the work speak for itself. On the third afternoon, she found a young calf with a gash along its leg from the fence wire. Not deep, but dirty, and already showing signs of swelling. She cleaned it the way she'd learned to clean wounds years ago, boiling water and a cloth, picking out the grit, binding it tight enough to hold but loose enough for circulation. Rodrigo saw her working and didn't say anything, but that evening at supper he passed her the cornbread without being asked. Ethan noticed the calf. He came in that evening and stood at the table where Clara was mending a split in one of Jesse's work shirts. She'd offered, Jesse had accepted with the immediate gratitude of a 15-year-old who had no idea how to do it himself. And he said, "That was good work on the calf." "Needed doing," she said. "Most people would have called it somebody else's job." She looked up. "Is that how this works? Everybody has jobs and nobody does anything else?" "No," he said. He pulled out a chair and sat down, which she hadn't expected. "I'm just saying I noticed." She went back to the mending. After a moment she said, "Where did you grow up?" "Iowa originally, came west at 19. He folded his hands on the table. "You?" "Pennsylvania, a city." "You don't seem like a city person." "I'm not sure I was ever a city person," she said. "I was just a person who lived in a city." She bit off the thread. "The city never really claimed me either." He was quiet for a moment. "That's an honest thing to say." "I'm trying to be honest with you," she said. "You were honest in your letters. It seemed fair." He looked at his hands. "I wasn't sure you'd come. After the last letter, when I told you about the financial situation with the cattle contract, I thought that might be the thing that changed your mind." She remembered that letter. He'd told her, in plain, straightforward sentences, that a contract he'd been counting on had fallen through, and the winter had cost him more than expected, and he wasn't sure how the next year would look. He'd said she deserved to know before she made her decision. She'd written back and said that people who warned you about the bad things before you arrived were generally people worth arriving for. "I meant what I said," she told him now. He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite done in the first days, when he'd been careful about it. "I believe you," he said. Pause. The trouble arrived on a Thursday. Clara had gone into town for flour and thread. Ethan had offered to send Jesse, and she'd told him she'd rather go herself, that she wanted to learn the town, that you couldn't understand a place without walking through it. She took the wagon in and managed the horses well enough, tied them at the post outside the general store, and went in. The store was owned by a man named Gideon Marsh, who had the kind of practiced friendliness that served as a replacement for warmth. He measured out her flour and quoted her a price that she was fairly certain was wrong, and when she said so, calmly, with the specific figure she'd been told to expect, his eyes went flat for a moment before the friendliness reasserted itself and he corrected it. She paid, took her package, and was almost to the door when Beatrice Holloway came in. She was with the same 2 women from the station. She stopped when she saw Clara. "Mrs. Callahan," she said. The word came out like a mispronunciation. "The wedding hasn't happened yet," Clara said. "No." Beatrice glanced at her package, then at her face. "I imagine you're hoping it will." Clara waited. I'm not a cruel woman, Beatrice said in the tone of someone who is about to say something cruel. I simply believe in being direct. This town is small, and what happens in it matters. When a man takes a mail-order bride, people wonder about his judgment. When that woman then tries to establish herself as a figure of some standing, she paused. It creates difficulties for everyone. I haven't tried to establish myself as anything, Clara said. Not yet, Beatrice said pleasantly. I'm not sure what you're afraid of, Clara said. Something moved across Beatrice's face, fast and then gone. I'm not afraid of anything, dear. I think you are, Clara said. She said it without heat, without performance, just as an observation. I think you've spent a long time deciding who belongs here and who doesn't, and the idea that someone might come in and not need your permission is uncomfortable. The two flanking women drew in synchronized breaths. Beatrice looked at her for a long moment. We'll see how long you last, she said, and she walked past her to the counter. Clara walked out into the dry afternoon air. Her hands were shaking, she discovered, not from fear, but from the particular physical response that comes when you say the true thing and can't unsay it. She stood by the wagon and breathed until her hands stopped. Then she loaded the flour and drove back to the ranch. Oh, she didn't tell Ethan what had happened at the store, not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't want it to be the first real conversation they had about difficulty. She needed to understand him better first, needed to know whether he was the kind of man who would want to fix it or deflect it, or whether he was the kind of man who would hear it and simply believe her and think about what to do. She was learning him in pieces. He was not naturally easygoing, but he was genuinely fair, which she thought was rarer. He didn't praise things that weren't good. He didn't criticize things that didn't need criticizing. He asked her opinion on things, the placement of a new shelf in the kitchen corner, a decision about which cattle to sell that fall. And when she gave it, he didn't dismiss it to see if she'd repeat herself. He considered it. On the 6th night, he told her about his brother. They were sitting on the rough bench outside the front of the house. It wasn't quite a porch, just a plank set on 2 stumps, and the sky was doing something elaborate in the west, all red and purple, and he'd brought out 2 cups of coffee and she'd said, "Thank you." And they'd sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then he said, "I had a brother, younger, Daniel." She waited. "He died 4 years ago, fever, in the middle of winter. We were working a claim up in Montana at the time, the 2 of us and a few others. By the time we could get him to a doctor, it was..." He stopped. Anyway, he was 22. She didn't say "I'm sorry," though she was. She said, "What was he like?" Ethan looked at the sky. He laughed a lot, easier than me, made friends everywhere he went. I always thought he was better suited to this kind of life than I was. The frontier, I mean. The starting from nothing part. He'd just look at it and say, "Well, might as well start building." "That's something," Claire said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "This ranch was supposed to be both of ours. I kept building it anyway. Felt like stopping would be..." He didn't finish. "A betrayal," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." She thought about the photograph she still carried of her mother, the apron her mother had worn, folded inside the suitcase, the way you carry the dead not as ghosts, but as reasons. "I understand that," she said. He looked at her again, that careful, considering look, and said, "I believe you do." The sky finished its display. They sat until the first stars came out, not talking, not needing to. 10 days after she arrived, Jesse came in from the morning rounds and said there was talk in town. He said it the way teenagers say difficult things, bluntly and all at once, like ripping off a bandage. "About what?" she asked, though she suspected. "Mrs. Holloway's been saying you tricked Mr. Callahan, that you lied in your letters about having money, that you came out here because nobody back home wanted you." He looked embarrassed to be the one delivering it. Pete heard it from the blacksmith, and the blacksmith heard it from Marsh at the general store. Clara set down the bowls she'd been washing. "What does Ethan know?" she asked. "Don't think he's heard yet. He was out at the north pasture since dawn." She thought for a moment. "Jesse." "Ma'am." "Thank you for telling me directly. That took courage." He scuffed his boot against the floor. Didn't feel like courage. Felt like the right thing. Sometimes those are the same, she said. She went back to the bowl. Then she stopped again. What do the other ranch hands think? She asked. The ones who've actually seen me here. Jesse didn't hesitate. Rodrigo says you'll do. Pete says he's seen worse, which from Pete is basically a compliment. A pause. I think you'll be fine. She appreciated that he said it not as comfort, but as genuine assessment. I hope you're right, she said. Ethan came in that evening and she could tell by his face that he'd heard. He sat down, took off his hat, put it on the table instead of the hook, which told her it had cost him something, whatever he'd heard. He looked at the hat for a moment. Marsh said something to me today when I stopped for nails, he said, about women who misrepresent themselves. She sat down across from him. What did you say? I said if he had something to tell me about my own business, he should say it plainly or not say it at all. She watched his face. And? He didn't have anything plain to say. He looked up at her. Clara. He hadn't used her name before, just her last name or nothing at all. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me straight. All right. Is there anything in those letters, anything you told me about yourself, that wasn't true? She met his eyes. No. He held her gaze for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face. She could see him deciding something. Not about whether to believe her, she thought, but about what to do with the fact that he already did. Beatrice Holloway runs this town's opinion the way she runs her household, he said finally. Tight, and she doesn't like things she doesn't control. He put his hat on the hook. This isn't your problem to solve alone. It's not your problem either, she said. It's mine. You're about to be my wife, he said. She blinked. He said it so matter-of-factly, like the thing was already true. I haven't signed anything yet, she said. No, he said. But you've been here 10 days, and you cleaned a calf's leg, and you argued with Gideon Marsh over correct pricing, and Jesse thinks you'll do, which means more than you'd think. He sat back. I made a judgment about your character from 12 letters. I'm making a judgment about your character now from 10 days, and my judgment is that Beatrice Holloway doesn't know what she's talking about. She looked at him for a long time. I had an engagement before, she said. That didn't end well. I know. You told me in your third letter. I didn't tell you everything. You don't have to tonight, he said, but whenever you want to, I'll listen. She felt something shift, not dramatically, not like a wall coming down, but the way ice shifts on a river in early spring, just a small movement, but underneath it, things beginning to run. She said, Then I'll tell you. And she did. She told him about Douglas and his family and their particular kind of cruelty dressed up as standards. She told him about the boarding house after her mother died and the 3 years she spent trying to make herself small enough for people to stop reminding her that she didn't quite belong. She told him that the letter to the agency wasn't desperation so much as a decision, a choice to stop waiting for the world to make space for her and to go somewhere and make space for herself. He listened. He didn't comfort her, didn't say that was wrong or you deserved better, the reflexive things. He just listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, That took more guts than most people give that kind of decision credit for. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't dramatic, but it was true. And it was exactly what she needed to hear. She slept better that night than she had in months. On the 14th day, Rodrigo found a second injured animal, this time one of the horses, a young mare who had caught her leg in a gap in the paddock fence and panicked, and done considerably more damage trying to get free than the wire had done initially. By the time Rodrigo found her, the leg was swollen to twice its size, and the mare was trembling. The nearest animal doctor was 12 miles away. Clara worked for 3 hours with hot water, clean cloth, and everything she knew, which wasn't a great deal, but was more than nothing. She kept talking to the mare while she worked, low and even, the same way she'd learned to talk to difficult people who needed calming. The horse's breathing steadied after the first hour. By the time Ethan came in from the south field, the mare was standing and the leg was bandaged, and Clara was sitting in the dirt of the paddock with her skirt ruined and her hair coming loose, just tired, Ethan crouched down beside the mare, checked the leg, looked at Clara. "She'll need watching," Clara said, "every few hours tonight." "I'll take the first watch," he said. I'll take the second." He looked at her, sitting in the dirt, wrecked, matter of fact. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she said. She got up, brushed off what she could. "I want to." She could see him trying to figure out what to do with that, with a woman who pitched in not to be useful but because she meant it, like he kept expecting her to stop. She didn't stop. She was beginning to think she might not. 2 weeks in, the town held its monthly social, a gathering at the Holloway House, which served as the de facto community hall, large enough to hold 60 people and appointed with the specific taste of a woman who wanted everyone to know exactly what she had and what they didn't. Ethan hadn't planned to go. He said socials weren't his thing, that he'd spent most of the last 4 years avoiding them, that the food was never worth the conversation. Clara said she thought they should go. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if we don't, it reads as hiding," she said. "And I'm not hiding." He thought about it. "You're not afraid of her." "I am," she said honestly. "But I'm not going to let that make my decisions." He put on his good shirt. They arrived late. Not late enough to make a scene, just late enough that the room was already full and everyone saw them come in together. Clara had worn her best dress, which was not fine by Black Ridge Valley standards, but was clean and well-fitted, and she held herself in it like it was. She felt every eye in the room. She kept her chin level. Beatrice was across the room when she saw them come in, and something moved across her face. Quick, controlled, but Clara saw it. Ethan stayed close. Not hovering, he was not a hovering man, but present. He introduced her to the Reverend, to 2 ranching families from the east side of the valley, to a woman named Ida who ran the school and seemed genuinely interested in Clara's years as a schoolroom assistant and asked her questions with actual curiosity. She found herself in a real conversation, which she hadn't entirely expected, and when she looked up after 20 minutes, she realized she'd moved 3 rooms deeper into the party without noticing. Ethan was watching her from across the room with that small, contained look. She raised an eyebrow slightly. He looked away quickly, like she'd caught him doing something. She had. The evening might have ended quietly, except that Beatrice chose the moment when the largest number of people were gathered near the fireplace to move in Clara's direction, her 2 usual companions at her flanks, a glass of something in her hand. "Well, Miss Whitmore," she said, still not using the right name, Clara noticed, still refusing the courtesy of the introduction that Ethan had clearly made. "You've made quite the impression on Ida Hartley. That's not nothing. Ida rarely talks to anyone." "She's interesting," Clara said. "She is." Beatrice smiled. It was a practice smile. "I hope you understand how things work here. Communities like ours have standards. Families have histories. Reputation means something." "I agree," Clara said. "Reputation does mean something." Beatrice looked at her over the rim of her glass. "Some reputations are very hard to build." "Some are," Clara said. "And some are earned in 2 weeks by sitting in the dirt to keep a horse from going lame." She said it pleasantly, not combatively, just as information. Someone nearby, she thought it was the Reverend's wife, made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Beatrice's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went very still. "We'll see," she said for the second time in their acquaintance. "I suppose we will," Clara said. She turned back to the conversation she'd been having, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the train at Black Ridge Valley, she felt the very small, very cautious beginning of belonging somewhere. It wasn't security. It wasn't acceptance. It was something rawer than that. Just the stubborn, unremarkable fact of still being there, still standing, still unwilling to be made to leave. That, she thought, was enough. For now. For now, it was enough. The small, cautious beginning of belonging that Clara had felt at the Holloway social didn't last the week. It never did, she was learning. In a town this size, with a woman like Beatrice running the current of opinion beneath everything, goodwill was not something that accumulated. It was something that had to be defended, constantly, the way you defended a fire in wind. Not because the fire was weak, but because the wind was relentless. It started with small things. The kind of things that could each be explained away if you only looked at one of them. On the Monday after the social, Clara went to the general store for salt and a bolt of canvas she needed for a repair on the barn's side wall. And Gideon Marsh was apologetic and smiling and told her he'd run out of both just that morning. When she turned to leave, she noticed 2 bolts of canvas on the shelf behind him, plain as anything. She didn't say so. She just walked out, untied the horse, and drove 2 miles further down the road to a smaller supply post run by an older man named Abe Turnbull, who had the salt and sold her 3 yards of canvas without making her feel like a problem to be managed. On Wednesday, Ida Hartley, the school teacher who had seemed genuinely warm at the social, passed her on the main street, saw her, and looked slightly away. Not rudely, not with malice. Just the careful avoidance of a woman who'd been told something since Saturday and was figuring out what to do with it. Clara noted it, filed it, kept moving. On Thursday, Ethan came in from town with a jaw set hard and his hat pushed back on his head in a way she'd come to recognize as his version of anger that hadn't found an outlet yet. He sat down at the table without saying anything. Clara put coffee in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Marsh told me," he said, "that he's heard from more than one source that you've been behaving in ways that are, quote, unsuitable for a woman in your position." She sat across from him. "What does that mean?" "Apparently it means that you spoke sharply to Beatrice at the social, and that you think very highly of yourself for someone who came here with nothing." He said it flatly, without conviction, the way you repeat something you find contemptible. "Those are the 2 charges, as far as I can translate Marsh." Clara wrapped her hands around her own cup. "I didn't speak sharply to her. I spoke honestly." "I know. There's a difference." "I know that too." He looked at her. "This isn't going to stop, Clara." "No," she said. "It probably isn't." "I can go and talk to Harold Holloway. He runs the town council officially, even if—" "No," she said. "Not yet." He frowned. "Why?" "Because if you go to her husband on my behalf, it looks like I can't manage my own situation, and it gives her exactly the story she's already trying to tell, that I'm a woman who needs a man to stand in front of her." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not that woman." He studied her for a moment. "I'm not trying to manage you." "I know," she said, "but I want to be the one who handles this first. If it gets worse, if it starts affecting the ranch, the contracts, anything real, then we handle it together. But right now this is gossip, and gossip you fight with presence." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded. "All right," he said, "but I want to know. If something happens, I want to know." "You'll know," she said. He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. "Jesse's been asking if he can learn to read better," he said, shifting gears with the practicality of a man who knew when a subject was closed. "He can read, just slow, and he said you used to work in a schoolroom." Clara blinked. "He mentioned that?" "Last night. He didn't ask directly, it was more of a— What he said was, 'I wonder if someone around here could help me with something.'" Ethan almost smiled. Not subtle. She thought about Jess, the freckled face, the honest nervousness, the way he'd told her about Beatrice's words at the station without softening them, because he thought she deserved to know. "I can work with him evenings," she said, "if you don't need him for anything." "I'll tell him after supper," Ethan said. She nodded. He got up to go back out to the afternoon work, and as he passed the table, he put his hand briefly on the back of her chair. Not touching her, not quite, just close. And then he was gone. She sat with her coffee for another minute. That small gesture cost him something, she thought. He was not a man who touched easily or showed things easily, and that small gesture, hand on the chair, not the woman, was the most he could manage in that direction right now. And she understood it because she was not a woman who received easily either. They were both, she thought, learning a new language with no dictionary. Jesse came to her after supper with a book under his arm and the expression of someone preparing to be embarrassed. It was a reader, the kind used in primary schools, thin pages, large type, illustrations of children doing wholesome activities in clean clothes that no actual child wore. He held it out to her like it might bite him. "Ethan said you'd help," he said. "You don't have to." "Sit down, Jesse," she said. He sat. She took the book, looked at it, set it aside. Tell me something, she said. What do you find hard about reading? Is it the letters not looking right? Or is it that you lose your place? Or is it that the words don't sound like how they look? He blinked. People don't usually ask that. Well, I'm asking. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. The words that don't sound how they look, he said, like tough. Why does that sound like tough? It's got an off in it. Should sound like trough or through. Why are they all different? That is a genuinely good question, she said, and the answer is that English is a language assembled from about 4 other languages by people who couldn't agree on spelling, so a lot of it is just something you have to memorize. He stared at her. That's terrible. It is, she agreed, but it also means that when you get stuck, it's not because you're not smart. It's because the system is inconsistent. She paused. You're not stupid, Jesse. I want to say that plainly before we start, so you hear it from someone who doesn't have a reason to flatter you. He went very still for a moment. Then he said gruffly, Okay. Okay, she said, and opened the book. They worked for an hour that first night, and then an hour again 2 days later. And then he started showing up without needing to be reminded, arriving after supper with the book, and sometimes with a second one he'd found, a cattle almanac, of all things, which he'd started reading on his own because it had useful information in it, and he was willing to fight the words to get to it. Rodrigo noticed. He didn't say anything, but one morning he brought her a cup of coffee without being asked, which for Rodrigo was practically a speech. 3 weeks in, the wedding was officially set. It was to be a small thing. The reverend, a few witnesses, paperwork filed with the county. No ceremony to speak of. Ethan had asked her what she wanted, and she'd said she wanted something that was real, more than something that was large. He'd said that was fine by him. They'd agreed on a Saturday. But 2 days before the Saturday, a woman came to the ranch. She arrived in the early afternoon while Ethan was out, which Clara suspected was not accidental. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair and a composed face, and the specific manner of a woman who had thought very carefully about what she was going to say before saying it. She gave her name as Helen Pratt. Clara had heard the name once, briefly. She was the wife of a rancher on the far side of the valley, someone Ethan had mentioned in passing without particular warmth. Clara offered her coffee. She accepted. They sat at the table. I'll be direct with you, Helen said. Please, Clara said. I'm not here on Beatrice's behalf. I want to say that first. She held her cup with both hands. Though she knows I've come, so I won't pretend otherwise. A pause. I'm here because I think you deserve to hear this from someone who isn't hostile. Clara kept her face even. Go on. There was a woman before you, Helen said. Not the one Ethan mentioned, someone else. About 3 years ago. She came out from Ohio, a widow, said she was interested in ranching life. She and Ethan spent time together. People thought it might lead somewhere. She looked at her cup. It didn't. She left suddenly. There were things said about why she left that were unkind to Ethan, and he dealt with it badly, and it took him a long time to… Recover isn't quite the right word. Get back to himself. Clara waited. Beatrice was the one who started those things being said, Helen said. She had reasons that had nothing to do with Ethan and everything to do with the woman's connection to a property dispute that affected Harold's business. But the effect on Ethan was real. She looked at Clara directly. What I'm trying to tell you is that Beatrice has done this before. She will use whatever she can find, and she will be patient about it, and she will not stop unless she decides it's not worth her time. What would make her decide that? Clara asked. Helen seemed to think about whether to answer. Then she said, Beatrice doesn't like people she can't embarrass. If you can't be embarrassed, if you just keep being exactly what you are and refuse to be made small, she'll eventually move on to something more productive. A pause. It takes nerve. I have some of that, Clara said. Helen looked at her for a moment, a real assessing look. Yes, she said, I think you might. She set down her cup. I'm not promising to be a friend. I'm telling you the terrain. What you do with it is your business. She left. Clara sat at the table for a while after the sound of the horse faded. She was not sure whether to feel warned or steadied. She decided to feel both. She told Ethan that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Helen Pratt came here," he said. Not a question, just settling it. "She came herself. She didn't send word." He looked at his hands. "She's a decent woman. She and her husband stay mostly to themselves." He didn't say anything about the rest of what Helen had told her, the woman from Ohio, the things Beatrice had said, and Clara didn't push. He'd heard it in the telling. He'd say something when he was ready. 3 days later, he said it. He came in late, after she'd already put supper on the table and Jesse had eaten and gone to bed in the bunk room at the back. He sat down and ate half his plate and then put his fork down and said, "The woman Helen told you about. Her name was Grace. She was kind. She wasn't bad for me, but she wasn't made for this." He gestured, not at the room exactly, but at all of it. The hard work, the rough house, the unfinished ranch, the weight of it. Beatrice found out about a timber deal that Grace's late husband had been involved in, something that intersected badly with Holloway land claims, and she used it to make Grace look dishonest. Most of what she said wasn't true. Some of it was just twisted enough to be unprovable either way. He paused. Grace left because it wasn't worth it to her to fight. Clara looked at him. "It was worth it to you," she said quietly. "It mattered," he said. "It still matters. A woman being run out of a place because someone decided she was inconvenient, that matters." She studied his face. "Is that why you put the notice in the paper again? After that?" "Partly." He picked up his fork, put it down again. "Partly I just got tired of the quiet." He said it plainly, without self-pity, just as a fact. A ranch is a lot of work for one person, not just physically, just there's nobody to tell things to. "I know that quiet," she said. "I know you do," he said. He looked at her. "I want you to know something. Whatever happens with Beatrice, whatever she says or tries, I'm not going to let it change what I think. I've known you 3 weeks. That's not nothing." 3 weeks is a short time, she said. "Sometimes," he said, "you can know a thing clearly in 3 weeks and be wrong about it in 3 years, and sometimes it works the other way." He picked up his fork for real this time. "I think I'm seeing you clearly." She sat with that for a moment. "All right," she said. "Then so do I." But the wedding happened on a gray Saturday with a cold wind out of the north, and nobody in attendance except Rodrigo, Jesse, Reverend Hughes, and a woman named Martha Hughes, who was the Reverend's wife, and who wept quietly through the whole thing, which Clara found both unexpected and deeply touching. Ethan held her hands through the ceremony and looked at her face the whole time, and not once at anything else. She looked back. There was no music. There were no flowers. The words were the legal words and the personal truth, and when it was done, Reverend Hughes shook Ethan's hand and patted Clara's arm and said something warm that she didn't entirely hear because her ears were still ringing slightly with the fact of what she'd just done. Jesse whooped. Outside in the cold air, Rodrigo produced a small bottle of whiskey from somewhere on his person and poured into 4 cups, declining one himself, offering the first to Clara, who took it and drank it and felt the burn all the way down and was glad for it. "Salud," Rodrigo said quietly. It was the most she'd heard him say at once. They ate supper at the big table that night, all of them together, Rodrigo and Jesse, and the 2 of them. And Jesse, who had been working through the cattle almanac, managed to read 2 passages aloud at dinner with only minor stumbling, and when he looked up and saw Clara nodding at him, he looked sideways immediately, as if he hadn't been hoping for exactly that. That night, after the others had gone, Ethan sat with her by the fire. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He looked at the fire. "This is not the life you planned." "No," she said. "But I didn't have a plan. I had a letter and a photograph and a decision." She glanced at him. "And you turned out to be a decent man, which was the main thing." "Your standard is low," he said. "My standard is accurate," she said. "Most people aren't decent. Decent is more than it sounds." He thought about that. Then he said, I want to build the porch next spring, proper this time, wide enough for chairs. I'd like that, she said. And a garden, if you wanted. The soil is hard, but it's workable. I'd like that too. He turned to look at her, directly, the way he did when he was going to say something that cost him something. I don't know, he said. How to be someone who... I haven't had a person in a long time. I might get it wrong. So will I, she said. We'll correct it when we notice. He held her gaze. Something in him settled. She could see it, a thing going still that had been braced for a long time. Okay, he said. She looked back at the fire. Outside, the wind was still coming out of the north, but inside the small, rough house with the crooked mantel and the mismatched chairs, it was warm. Not perfect, not easy, but warm. She let herself feel it just for a moment. The strange, improbable fact of being somewhere she hadn't been yesterday. She let herself feel it without explaining it, or qualifying it, or wondering how long it would last. Just warm. Just now. In the weeks that followed the wedding, Beatrice Holloway did nothing. Clara had expected an escalation. She'd prepared herself for one, kept a watchful eye on the way people responded to her in town, tracked the small signals, who nodded, who looked away, who found reasons not to engage. But the assault she'd anticipated didn't come, and that somehow made her more uneasy than the whispers had. Silence from a woman like Beatrice wasn't peace, it was strategy. She kept going into town, she kept herself visible. She brought Jesse with her sometimes, and his ease in her company, the way he talked to her like a regular person, the way she talked back the same way, said something that words couldn't have. People notice how a young person moves around someone. If they're relaxed, it registers. Ida Hartley stopped avoiding her. The second time they passed on the street, Ida stopped and said, I owe you an apology. I was told something and I shouldn't have let it change my behavior without... Anyway, I'm sorry. Clara said, What were you told? Ida had the grace to look uncomfortable. That you'd misled Ethan about your circumstances. Your finances specifically. She paused. I don't know why I thought that was my concern. It's his ranch. His decision. It is, Claire said. But for what it's worth, I didn't misrepresent anything. I told him exactly what I had, which was not much. He made his decision with full information. That's what I should have assumed, Ida said. You're a school teacher, Clara said. You're used to verifying things before you teach them. That's not a bad habit. Ida looked at her. You're more forgiving than I'd be. I'm not forgiving anything, Clara said evenly. I'm just not interested in carrying it. There's a difference. They spoke for another 10 minutes. About the school, about the children, about whether Clara might be willing to come in and speak to the older students about Pennsylvania, about what the country was like further east. Clara said she'd think about it. She thought she probably would. She told Ethan about it that evening. He was mending a bridle at the table, the kind of repetitive work that let him half listen while she talked, and she'd come to appreciate that about him, that he had a way of being present without requiring that she perform for his attention. Ida's decent, he said. She got scared. People do. I know, she said. I'm not holding it against her. She sat down. I'm trying to figure out what Beatrice is doing. She's quiet. He kept his eyes on the bridle. She's watching. Watching for what? Something she can use. He pulled the leather tight. She's patient. It's her best quality and her worst one. He paused. There's a town meeting next month about water rights. The creek that runs along the north edge of my property feeds 2 other ranches before it reaches the Holloway land, and Harold has been pushing for a usage agreement that would effectively give him first allocation rights after drought conditions. Clara went still. First allocation rights? Meaning if there's a dry season, and there will be, there's always a dry season eventually, my cattle would get water only after his due, even though my property is upstream. Can he do that? He can if the council votes for it, and the council does what Beatrice tells it. She looked at him. Is that what this is about? She wants leverage over the ranch, and removing me is part of that? He set down the bridle. I don't know. Maybe both things are real at once. She genuinely dislikes the idea of you here, and she also sees opportunity in a distracted or destabilized property. He looked at her. I should have told you earlier. When did you find out? Month ago, before you arrived. She kept her face even, but something in her chest did a quiet, complicated thing. You didn't mention it in your letters. No. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Because I didn't want it to be one more reason for you not to come. And that was probably not the right judgment. It was the first thing he'd said that genuinely frustrated her. Not the withholding exactly, but the calculation behind it, the decision to protect her from information she had the right to. She pressed her lips together. I need to know things like this, she said. I'm not here to be managed. I'm here to be a partner. I know, he said. I was wrong. She looked at him. He was looking back at her without deflecting, without qualifying, just the plain statement and the eye contact. She let the frustration settle. It didn't go away entirely, but it found its level. The water rights meeting, she said. When is it? 6 weeks? Then we have 6 weeks to figure out something. He picked up the bridle again. I've been thinking about the county land records, the original creek survey from when this land was filed. If I can get a copy, I think it may have language about natural water rights that predates the town council's authority. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this. For about a month, he said, with a dryness that was the closest he came to irony. Then I'll help you look, she said. I'm good at reading documents. 3 years in a schoolroom teaches you to find the line that matters in a page of things that don't. He looked at her, that careful, clear-eyed look. All right, he said. We'll go to the county office Thursday. She nodded. Then she said, Ethan, don't do that again. I won't, he said, and she believed him. The county office was a 3-hour drive each way, which meant a full day and an early start. They left before the sun fully cleared the horizon, Clara with a wool blanket across her lap, and Ethan driving with the particular focus of a man who knew this road well enough not to need to think about it. They talked, because 6 hours in a wagon either produced silence or conversation, and they had both reached the point where silence between them was comfortable, but conversation was better. He told her more about Daniel. Not the death, he'd told her that, but the living. Daniel, at 18, deciding they should go west on a handshake and a rumor. Daniel losing all their savings in a card game and confessing it immediately and working for 6 months without complaint to replace it. Daniel's ability to walk into a room of strangers and be somehow at ease within minutes. Were you jealous of that? Clara asked. The ease with people. He thought about it. No, not jealous. I never knew how he did it. I'd watch him and think, what is he doing exactly? And I couldn't figure it out. You're better with people than you think, she said. He glanced at her. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, she said. You're not easy, but you're honest, and people who've been around dishonest men for a while can feel the difference. You don't perform things. That reads as real. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You notice a lot. 3 years reading children's faces to figure out who understood the lesson and who was pretending, she said. It gets into the habit. He looked at the road. What do you see when you look at me? It was the most direct personal question he'd asked her. She considered it seriously. A man who works very hard to do things right, she said, and gets frustrated with himself when he doesn't. A man who is more capable of loyalty than he knows. A man who lost something important and kept building anyway, which is harder than people give credit for. She paused. And a man who doesn't quite believe yet that what he's built is worth staying for. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, that last one. I know, she said. Is it that obvious? Only if you're watching, she said. I watch. He turned to look at her, properly, not just a glance. The road was straight and the horse knew it, so he could afford the look. She met it. I'm glad you came, he said. It was a simple sentence, the simplest possible sentence for the thing he meant. And because it was him, that simplicity made it more, not less. So am I, she said. She turned back to the road, and the morning light came across the flat land and the wagon moved forward. And they were both quiet for a while, but it was the kind of quiet that held something rather than the kind that emptied it out. The county office, when they reached it, smelled of dust and old paper, and the particular institutional staleness of records nobody had touched in years. The clerk was a young man who seemed surprised to have visitors, and slightly alarmed by the specificity of what they needed. Clara asked the questions while Ethan stood at her shoulder, and she watched the clerk's face while he processed them. And when he started to say it might take some time to locate the survey documents, she said, "I'll wait. What year would they have been filed?" He told her. She asked him to look. He found them. She read through the survey documents at the clerk's desk while Ethan watched over her shoulder. And there it was, 3 pages in the faded legal language of a county surveyor who had done his job carefully and without decoration. Natural waterway rights established at the time of original filing, running with the land and not subject to later municipal reallocation without the consent of the upstream property holder. She looked at Ethan. He looked at the page. "That's what I needed," he said quietly. "That's what you needed," she agreed. She asked the clerk to make them a copy. He did. She folded it carefully and put it inside her coat, close to her ribs, the same place she'd kept the photograph on the train from Pennsylvania. On the drive home, Ethan said, "You were right about reading documents." "I usually am about things like that," she said, without apology. He almost smiled. "You're getting more comfortable saying things like that," he observed. "Around you," she said. "Yes." She looked at the road ahead of them. "You don't seem to need me to be smaller to feel bigger. It's easier to take up space around someone like that." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to take up space," he said. "This is your ranch, too." She looked out at the land, the flat reach of it, the big, ugly, beautiful sky. "I'm starting to feel that," she said. And she was. The copy of the survey document stayed in Clara's coat pocket for 3 days before she transferred it to the tin box under the floorboard, where Ethan kept the ranch's legal papers. She didn't tell him she'd moved it. He noticed anyway. "Smart," he said, when he opened the box for something else and saw it there, refolded and tucked under the deed. "I would have left it somewhere foolish." "You would have left it on the table," she said. "Jesse would have used it to mark his page in the almanac." Ethan looked at her. That is exactly what would have happened. She went back to what she was doing, and he went back to what he was doing, and that small exchange, 2 people knowing each other well enough to predict each other's small failures, settled into the morning like it had always belonged there. But the survey document, for all its legal weight, did not resolve anything. It was ammunition without a battle yet. The town meeting on water rights was still 5 weeks away, and in those 5 weeks, Black Ridge Valley continued its life around them. The ranches, the commerce, the gossip, the particular social weather of a small community where everyone knew everything, and some people used that knowledge like a tool, and some used it like a weapon. Beatrice Holloway had been quiet for nearly a month. Clara did not trust it. She mentioned this to Helen Pratt on a Tuesday when they happened to be at Abe Turnbull's supply post at the same time. Helen was buying feed. Clara was buying lamp oil and thread. They had arrived at an unspoken arrangement of cautious mutual respect. Not friendship exactly, but something in that direction. "She's waiting for you to relax," Helen said. She didn't look up from the bolt of cloth she was examining. "She does this. She steps back until people assume it's over, and then she moves." "Moves how?" Clara asked. "Depends on what she's decided you are." Helen set the cloth down. "If she thinks you're temporary, if she thinks you'll leave the way Grace Albright did, then she'll make one large public move to speed it along." She glanced at Clara. "If she's decided you're not temporary, she'll try to make Ethan doubt you instead. Get between you rather than try to push you out directly." Clara thought about this. "She hasn't spoken to Ethan that I know of." "She won't do it directly," Helen said. "It'll come through Harold, through the council, through business, something that makes him feel the pressure of having chosen you." She picked up her feed order. "I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it because you seem like a woman who does better with information than without it." "I am," Claire said. "Thank you." Helen looked at her for a moment with the expression she often had, assessing, not unkind. "You're managing this better than I expected," she said. "Most women in your position would have either crumbled or gone aggressive. You've done neither." "There's a lot of ground between crumbling and going aggressive," Clara said. Helen almost smiled. "Yes," she said. There is. And she left. The move, when it came, arrived through a man named Court Dillard. He showed up at the ranch on a Wednesday morning when Ethan was out checking on the east herd and Clara was alone except for Rodrigo, who was visible across the yard but out of easy earshot. Dillard was perhaps 45, with a broad face and the kind of comfortable manner that suggested he'd learned long ago how to make an entry before people had decided whether they wanted him there. He tied his horse at the post and came to the door of the house and knocked. Clara opened it. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. He had a hat in his hands, turning it. "Name's Dillard. I'm an associate of Harold Holloway's. I was hoping to speak with your husband." "He's not here," she said. "When might he be back?" "I'm not certain," she said. "Is there something I can help you with?" Something moved across his face. She clocked it. That tiny recalibration men made when they'd expected to be waved through and found a door instead. "It's a business matter," he said, "regarding the upcoming water rights discussion." "I know about the water rights discussion," she said. "What's the offer?" He blinked. "Ma'am?" "You're an associate of Harold Holloway's. You've come before the town meeting. You're being careful about your words," she said. "That means there's an offer. What is it?" He turned his hat one more time. Then he seemed to decide that directness, since she was demanding it, was the easier path. "Mr. Holloway is prepared to drop his push for preferential allocation," Dillard said, "in exchange for a 20-year lease on the northern 40 acres of the Callahan property, grazing rights. He'd pay fair market rate." Clara looked at him. "The northern 40, she said, is the section that contains the water source." Dillard's expression remained neutral. "The creek runs through a corner of it, yes. The creek that the survey establishes as protected under natural waterway rights," she said. "The survey filed at the time of original land claim, which we have a copy of." There it was. His composure shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. "I wasn't aware," he started. "I'd like you to tell Mr. Holloway that we decline his offer," she said, "and that we'll be bringing the survey documentation to the town meeting. He's welcome to review it before then if he'd like." She paused. "Is there anything else?" Dillard looked at her for a long moment. He put his hat back on. "I'll pass that along," he said. He rode out. Clara stood in the doorway and watched until he was out of sight, then let out a breath that she'd been holding for approximately the entire conversation. Her heart was going at a rate that was not dignified, but her face had been still the whole time, and that was what mattered. Rodrigo materialized from somewhere behind her. "That was Dillard," he said. It was less a question than a confirmation. "You know him?" "He works for Holloway. Does his arrangements." He said it with the specific distaste of a man who had been on the receiving end of someone's arrangements before. "What did he want?" She told him. He listened with his arms folded, expression unreadable. When she finished, he said, "You sent him back empty." "Yes." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Good." He went back to work. Ethan's response, when she told him that evening, was a silence that lasted about 30 seconds and covered a great deal of ground. "He came when he knew I was out," he said finally. "Yes?" "And you handled it?" "Yes." He looked at her. "You told him about the survey." "I did. I thought the advantage of them knowing we had it outweighed the advantage of surprising them with it at the meeting." She met his eyes. "If I was wrong about that, tell me." He thought about it for a genuine moment. Not the quick dismissal of a man who wanted to avoid conflict, but actual consideration. "No," he said. "You're right. If they know about the document now, they can't build their case around assuming we don't have it. They have to change strategy, and that takes time they don't have before the meeting." "That's what I thought," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Beatrice sent a man to my house to make a deal with my wife while I was in the field." "She sent Harold's man," Clara said. "She probably didn't think I'd be the one doing the talking." "No," he said. "She didn't." Something moved through his expression. Not quite anger, but the near neighbor of it. "That's going to stop. Ethan,
I'm not going to go confront her, he said. I know what you said about handling things, but she came to my house. She went around me. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. At the meeting, I want to present the document myself. With you. Together. She looked at him. Together, she repeated. This is your ranch, he said. You just proved it in a way that I couldn't have if I'd been the one standing at that door, because Dillard would never have shown his hand to me that fast. He met her eyes. I want people to see that. She felt something shift in her chest. Not soft, not sentimental, but solid. The feeling of a thing being named that had been true for a while but unspoken. All right, she said. Together. The town meeting was held in the schoolhouse, which was the largest neutral building in Black Ridge Valley and smelled of chalk and the particular wood stove heat of an enclosed space with too many people in it. By the time Clara and Ethan arrived, most of the ranching families were already seated on the long benches, and Harold Holloway was at the front table with two men Clara didn't recognize, lawyers from the county seat, she assumed, brought in for the occasion. Beatrice was there too. She sat in the front row to the side, not at the council table. She was never officially anywhere, but positioned to be seen by everyone. She was wearing charcoal gray, which on her looked less like a color choice and more like a statement. Clara and Ethan took seats in the middle. Helen Pratt was 2 rows back and gave Clara a brief, acknowledging nod. Ida Hartley was near the window, and she caught Clara's eye and did not look away. Jesse had wanted to come. Ethan had told him he could. He was in the back row with Rodrigo, who was there because he said he had an interest in the outcome, and nobody had told him otherwise. The meeting opened with Harold Holloway making his case for the usage agreement, a long, carefully constructed argument about community resource management, shared prosperity, the need for formal agreements in times of scarcity. He had documents of his own. His lawyers presented them with the practiced ease of men who did this for a living. The room was attentive. A few ranchers asked questions. Harold answered them smoothly. Clara watched the room while he talked, the way she'd learned to watch a classroom, not just the person speaking, but everyone else, the shifts in attention and the furrowed brows and the moments when people wanted to ask something but didn't. There were 3 ranchers on the south end of the bench who kept glancing at each other. She noted them. When Harold finished, the council chair, a man named Elias Pruitt, who had the uncomfortable expression of someone caught between 2 stronger forces, asked if anyone had a response. Ethan stood. He was not a natural speaker. He knew this about himself, and he didn't try to be something he wasn't. He spoke in the same plain, direct way he did everything else, without performance, and because of that, the room went quiet in a way it hadn't for Harold's more polished presentation. He laid out the facts. The original survey, the natural waterway rights, the language that predated the council's authority to reallocate. Then he passed the document to Clara. She stood beside him and read the relevant passage aloud. Her voice was clear, and she did not rush it. When she finished, one of the 3 ranchers on the south bench, a weathered man named Sutton, said, "If that language holds, the whole proposal is void." "It holds," Ethan said. Harold's lawyers started to speak. Clara had anticipated this and had already looked at the counterargument, that the natural rights language was specifically tied to the original filing party and didn't necessarily transfer. She'd thought about it for 3 days. She addressed it before the lawyer finished his sentence. "The rights language is tied to the land, not the individual," she said. "Standard county practice since the revision of 1871. The filing number is in the document. You can verify it with the county office, which we already have." A silence. Harold looked at her from the front table. He looked at her like a man looking at something he hadn't accounted for. Beatrice, in the front row, was very still. The council voted. The water rights proposal failed 4-2. Harold kept his expression neutral with the practiced ease of a man who had lost things before and knew how to stand up afterwards. He shook a few hands, spoke quietly with his lawyers. Beatrice did not look at Clara directly. Not once during the vote, not once after. She looked at the wall, at the window, at her husband's shoulder. She was the kind of woman who would not grant you the acknowledgement of her attention unless it was on her own terms. But Clara didn't need Beatrice's attention. She needed the look she got from Sutton, the rancher from the south bench, who came up to her afterward and said, "You know water law."
I can read documents, she said. Same thing, out here. He shook her hand like she was a person whose hand was worth shaking. Good work. She thanked him. He went and spoke with Ethan. The two of them talked for several minutes, and she could see from the slight change in Ethan's posture, something in the shoulders, that it was a good conversation. Helen Pratt stopped beside her on the way out. She's not done, Helen said quietly. I know, Clara said, but that was well done. Thank you, Clara said. Helen left. Ida Hartley touched Clara's arm briefly as she passed. Just briefly, just contact, and that small gesture meant more than she would have predicted. Outside, the evening was cold and clear, and Ethan found her standing by the wagon with her breath making small clouds in the air. He came and stood beside her. Sutton's interested in a grazing arrangement, he said. His south pasture is overgrazed and he's got more cattle than land. Wants to talk about using our north section on a seasonal basis. On our terms? She said. On our terms, he confirmed. She looked at the sky. The first stars were coming out the way they did out here. Sudden and assertive, no hesitation. Beatrice is going to do something else, she said. Yes. Do you have any idea what? He was quiet for a moment. She lost something tonight, not just the vote. She lost the certainty that the Callahan Ranch is manageable. He paused. Women like her don't lose things gracefully. Clara thought about this. She thought about the way Beatrice had sat through the entire meeting with her eyes anywhere but Clara's face. The deliberateness of it, the refusal, the control it required. She's going to make it personal, Clara said. She can't come at the ranch anymore, not directly, so she's going to come at me. Probably, he said. She looked at him. Will you let me handle it when it comes? He looked back at her, and she could see him considering the instinct to protect, the competing knowledge of who she was. Up to a point, he said. After that point, we handle it together. What's the point? You'll know it when you reach it, he said. And so will I. He held her gaze. I trust your judgment, Clara. But I am your husband. Not because you need managing, because if something happens to you, it happens to me. That's what this is. She looked at him for a long moment. Fair, she said. He helped her up to the wagon seat. Rodrigo and Jesse were already in the back. They drove home through the cold dark, and Jesse fell asleep against the sideboard before they were halfway there. And Rodrigo smoked a pipe in silence, and Clara sat beside Ethan with the stars overhead and the road ahead and the survey document folded in the tin box back home where it belonged. The personal attack came on a Friday. Not from Beatrice directly, it never was. It came through the wife of a council member named Dorothea Crane, who was not malicious herself but was easily used by someone who was. Dorothea came into Turnbull's supply post while Clara was there, with two other women, and the conversation that had apparently been going on before they arrived continued as if Clara weren't in the room. Apparently it's been said she had a child before, Dorothea was saying, back in Pennsylvania, that she gave it up. Clara went still at the counter. Where did you hear that? One of the women asked. I can't say exactly, but more than one person has mentioned it. Dorothea's voice was not cruel, just carrying the information with the careful concern of someone who believed they were simply repeating facts. It's the kind of thing a man has a right to know about the woman he married, I would think. Clara set down the spool of wire she'd been holding. She turned around. Dorothea saw her and went the color of old chalk. Mrs. Crane? Clara said. She kept her voice level and she looked directly at the woman. I'd like you to tell me where that came from. Dorothea opened her mouth. Nothing came out. I have never had a child, Clara said. I have never given a child up. That is a fabrication, and I think you know that, and I think you know where it came from, even if you won't say, said, breathing through her nose. The shaking wasn't fear. She'd identified it now. It was the physical response to rage that had nowhere to go. The hot, trapped feeling of being lied about in a way that went to the center of who you were, and knowing the lie was constructed not randomly, but deliberately, aimed at something specific. Beatrice had chosen this particular lie because it was the kind of thing that made a man question the woman he'd married, The kind of thing that couldn't be entirely disproved, that stuck in the imagination like a splinter, even after you said you believed someone. She drove home. She told Ethan at supper. He listened. When she finished, he said one word. Beatrice. Without question, she said. He looked at his plate. Then he pushed it back and put his hands flat on the table. I'm going to talk to Harold. Ethan. No, he said. And his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Not loud, not heated, just final. I've let this go its natural direction, and I've trusted your judgment, and you've been right. But she's put a lie into this town's air about my wife, and about a child that doesn't exist, and that is something I will not sit with. He looked at her. You asked me to let you handle it first. You've handled everything first. This is the thing I need to do. She looked at him. She wanted to argue. The argument was right there. She'd been managing this. She had a strategy. Going to Harold would look like weakness, or escalation, or both. All of that was true. But she looked at his face. The controlled, quiet anger of a man who had been patient and was done being patient, and who was asking what, not demanding, but asking, to be allowed to do the one thing available to him. She thought about what it cost him to sit still while his wife was systematically dismantled by a woman with nothing but time and malice. All right, she said. He nodded. He got up and got his coat. Tonight? She said. Now, he said. Man, he was gone 2 hours. Clara sat by the fire and did not pretend to do anything useful. She had a book open on her lap that she didn't read. Jesse came in at some point, read her expression, said, I'll take the last water check on the mare, and disappeared again with the tact that he'd developed over the past weeks into something genuinely impressive for a 15-year-old. Rodrigo came in, poured himself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and drank it without speaking. His presence was not intrusive. She found it unexpectedly a comfort. He was a man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing was simply to stay. Ethan came back at 9. He came in, hung his coat, sat at the table. Well, she said. Harold knows, he said. He knew before tonight. He's been managing Beatrice, which means he tells her yes, and then quietly makes sure the worst of it doesn't land. He's been doing it for 20 years, from what I can read between what he actually said. He looked at the fire. He's not a bad man. He's a man who married a force of nature and ran out of ways to redirect it a long time ago. What did he say about the lie? He said he'd speak to her. He paused. His exact words were, I can't guarantee anything, but I will make the consequences clear to her. Do you believe him? Ethan thought about it. I believe he'll try. Whether it does anything, he shook his head. She's been running things in this town a long time. That doesn't stop in one conversation. He looked at her, but he also said something else. She waited. He said Beatrice has been on the wrong side of things before. About Grace Albright, the business with the timber claim. He said there were people in this town who haven't forgotten that, and that if she pushes too hard, the town will push back. He looked at Clara. He was, I think, telling me that she's not as unassailable as she seems. Clara absorbed this. He was telling us to hold on, she said. Yes, he said, in so many words. She looked at the fire. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not gently, not sentimentally, just solidly. The hand of a man who was telling her something he couldn't quite say yet. We're not losing this. She turned her hand over and held his. No, she said. We're not. Outside, the wind had come up, and it moved against the walls of the small house with its crooked mantel and its mismatched chairs and its tin box under the floorboard, the house that was raw and unfinished and entirely theirs. She held his hand, and they sat there while the fire went down, and neither of them moved to add wood, and neither of them spoke, and the wind did what wind does and eventually settled, and the night went quiet, and they were still there. That, she thought, was the thing Beatrice Holloway could not fabricate and could not take and could not outlast. Just this. Just two people who had decided to hold on, still holding. Harold Holloway spoke to his wife. Whatever he said, Clara never learned the specifics of it. She wasn't sure she wanted to. What she learned was the effect. For 10 days after Ethan's visit, Beatrice Holloway was quiet in a way that felt different from her previous silences. Less like strategy, more like a woman recalculating. The lie about the child didn't spread further. Whether that was Harold's doing or the town's own immunity to one story too many, Clara couldn't say. Dorothea Crane crossed the street to avoid her twice, then on the third occasion stopped and said, stiffly but directly, "I repeated something I shouldn't have. I'm sorry for it." Clara said thank you and meant it, and they went their separate ways, and that, as far as Clara was concerned, was the end of Dorothea's role in the whole affair. What couldn't be undone was the awareness that the lie had existed. She felt it sometimes, in a room, in a conversation, the faint shadow of a thing that had been said and retracted, but not entirely erased. That was the nature of that kind of lie. You could correct it. You couldn't unrelease it into the air. She didn't tell Ethan when she felt it, not because she was hiding it, but because naming it gave it more weight than it deserved, and she was trying to be precise about what deserved her attention. She focused instead on the ranch. The grazing arrangement with Sutton had moved from conversation to paperwork, and Clara had sat at the table with both men and the relevant documents and worked through the terms with a careful eye that surprised Sutton and did not surprise Ethan, who had by now stopped being surprised by her and simply incorporated her into how things worked. She'd found a clause in Sutton's proposed draft that would have allowed him to extend the seasonal arrangement indefinitely with only 30 days' notice, which was not what Ethan had agreed to verbally, and she'd crossed it out and written the corrected language in the margin in her clean, schoolroom hand and passed it back across the table. Sutton had read it, looked at her, and said, "Fair." Ethan had said nothing. But that evening he'd told Jessie, within her hearing, that Clara had a sharper eye for contracts than any lawyer he'd dealt with, which was not entirely true but was the kind of thing that mattered in a bunkhouse. The calf she'd treated in her first weeks was fully healed now and growing into something that would be worth real money by spring. The mare's leg had healed cleanly. The north pasture was producing better than the previous year, partly because Clara had noticed that the irrigation channel from the creek was partially blocked by debris and had organized its clearing with the kind of practical efficiency that came from years of having to solve problems without asking permission first. Small things, but small things were what a ranch was made of. Mount. It was Rodrigo who told her, on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, that something had shifted in town. He came in from a supply run and set the goods on the table and stood for a moment in the way he had when he was organizing a thought into words. "People are talking about you differently," he said. She looked up from the mending. "Differently how?" "The kind of differently where they're not talking about you and Beatrice anymore. They're just talking about you." He paused. "Sutton told Marsh that you saved Ethan's water rights. Marsh told someone else. Now the story going around is that the Callahan Ranch is being run by two people who know what they're doing." She set down the mending. "That's better than the alternative." "Yes," he said. He picked up his coffee and drank. "There are 3 women who came into town this fall on their own. No family, no arrangement. One of them works at the hotel. 2 are looking for work." He looked at the window. "They've been asking about you." She was quiet for a moment. "Asking what?" "How you did it," he said simply. "How you came with nothing and made something of it." She thought about that. 3 women she'd never met, asking questions about her. The particular strange weight of becoming an example to someone. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she said. "No," Rodrigo agreed. "But you did it where people could see." He drank the rest of his coffee and rinsed the cup, and that, apparently, was everything he'd intended to say. She sought out the woman at the hotel 2 days later. Her name was Rose Finney. She was perhaps 25, with a practical face and the watchful stillness of someone who'd learned to read rooms quickly. She was wiping down the hotel's front counter when Clara came in and asked for a few minutes of her time, and Rose looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between wariness and hope, which Clara recognized because she'd worn it herself not so long ago. They sat in the corner of the hotel's small front room with coffee, and Clara said, "I heard you've been asking about how things work here." Rose looked at her directly. "I heard you came as a mail-order bride and you're still standing," she said, "and that you held your own at the water rights meeting, and that a woman named Beatrice Holloway tried to run you out and couldn't."
She paused. I wanted to know if that was true. Most of it, Clara said. The parts about Beatrice are still in progress. Rose almost smiled. But you didn't leave. I didn't leave, Clara said. What are you looking for? Work or something more permanent? I don't know yet, Rose said. I came from Missouri. I was working as a seamstress and the shop closed, and the owner's son made it clear that my continued employment was conditional on things I wasn't willing to agree to. She said it plainly, without drama, as a statement of fact. I had enough money for the train and a month's lodging. I've been here 3 weeks. Clara looked at her. The careful face, the steady eyes, the practiced composure of a woman who'd been managing her own situation for long enough that she'd gotten good at it. Can you cook? Clara asked. Better than most, Rose said. Can you work animals? I can learn. Jesse's 15, Clara said. He's learning too. Rodrigo doesn't talk much, but he's fair, and he'll teach you if you show you're serious. She paused. We don't have money for another wage right now, but we have the room that Ethan uses for storage. It's small, but it's dry, and it has a stove, and we have food. In spring, when the Sutton arrangement starts and the income improves, there'd be a wage. She looked at Rose. It's not much, but it's real. Rose was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee. Does your husband know you're offering this? She asked. Not yet, Clara said, but he will tonight, and I know what his answer will be. How? Because I know him, Clara said. Ethan's answer that evening was a single question. Can she work? She says she can learn, Clara said. Good enough, he said, and went back to the harness he was repairing. Rose Finney arrived at the Callahan Ranch on a Thursday morning with a bag not much larger than the one Clara had brought off the train from Pennsylvania, and Jesse helped her with it like it was the most natural thing in the world, and Rodrigo showed her the cook stove and the water pump with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he'd shown Clara months ago. Clara watched from across the yard and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for, something adjacent to recognition. Come. November brought cold in earnest, and the cold brought the kind of work that didn't pause for anything. Frozen water troughs, animals that needed extra feed, equipment that seized in the low temperatures and required the kind of patient, cold-handed attention that was exhausting in a different way than summer work was. Clara had not grown up with this kind of cold, not the outdoor physical kind that settled into your hands and stayed there, and she made mistakes. She lost feeling in 2 fingers on her left hand one afternoon, and Ethan found her trying to carry on regardless, and made her come inside and sit with her hands in warm water, while he said nothing about it but stayed in the kitchen doing nearby work until the color came back to her face. I should have worn the heavier gloves, she said. Yes, he said. He didn't elaborate. You could say I told you so, she said. You mentioned the gloves this morning. I could, he said. But you already know it. So what would that accomplish? She looked at him. You're very aggravating sometimes. I know, he said. She almost laughed. You don't even sound sorry about it. I'm not sorry about it, he said. You're the most capable person I've been around in years, and sometimes capable people need reminding that they don't know everything. The cold is one of the things you don't know yet. He paused. That's not a character flaw. It's just weather. She put her hands back in the warm water. You're better at this than you think you are, she said. At what? At knowing what to say. She looked up at him. You said when we married that you might get it wrong. You don't get it wrong as often as you thought you would. He considered this. I get it wrong other times. So do I, she said. We correct it when we notice. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face she was still learning to read. It was not simple. It was not one thing. It was the complicated expression of a man who had spent a long time expecting things to go wrong and was slowly, carefully, against his own habit, starting to believe they might not. The porch, he said. I want to start it in spring as soon as the ground thaws. I know, she said. I mean right away. First thing. She understood what he was doing, planning a stake in the future, out loud, as a way of claiming it. She did the same thing sometimes, the same impulse. First thing, she said. The second Holloway move came in December, and it was both more sophisticated and more transparent than anything that had come before, which told Clara that Beatrice was running out of patience.
It began with an invitation, a formal card delivered to the ranch by a boy she didn't recognize, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Callahan in Beatrice's precise handwriting. An invitation to the Holloway's annual winter gathering, their largest social event of the year, the one that everyone in the valley's upper tier attended, and whose guest list was, Clara had been told by Helen, carefully managed and deeply meaningful as a signal of standing. They had never been invited before. Ethan read the card twice and set it on the table. "What does this mean?" Clara asked, though she had her own theory. "It means she's changed tactics," he said. "She can't move against us from the outside anymore, so she's going to try from the inside." He turned the card over. "She'll invite us in, be publicly gracious, and then find a way to humiliate you in a setting where everyone who matters is watching and you have nowhere to go." "That's what I think too," Clara said. "We don't have to go," he said. "If we don't go," Clara said, "she tells the story. We declined. We were afraid. We knew we didn't belong." She picked up the card. "We have to go." He looked at her. "You know what she's planning." "Roughly," Clara said. "But so does she. And I've had months to watch her, and she doesn't know that. She's been underestimating me since the day I stepped off the train." She set the card down. "I'd like to let her keep doing that for one more evening." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" It was the right question. Not "are you sure?" or "be careful," or "let me handle it." Just the right question. "Stay close," she said. "Don't intervene unless I ask. And if I ask, don't hesitate." He nodded. Done. Helen Pratt came to the ranch the following day, which was not an accident. She arrived in the mid-morning, and Clara met her at the door, and she said, "I heard you got an invitation," without preamble. "Word travels," Claire said. "In this valley, word doesn't travel. It teleports." Helen came inside and sat, and Claire put coffee between them, and Helen said, "She's going to use the gathering to announce something. I don't know what exactly, but I've seen this before. The invitation after a long silence is always a setup. She invites you in, neutralizes the threat by pretending she's accepted you, and then presents something that makes you look small in front of everyone who matters." "What kinds of things has she presented before?" Clara asked. Helen looked at her cup. "With Grace Albright, it was documents. She had paperwork relating to Grace's late husband's business dealings. Real documents, but taken wildly out of context. And she presented them at a social gathering as if she was being helpful, expressing concern, asking innocent questions that had very damaging implications." She paused. "She's a skilled woman. I'll give her that much." "What would she have on me?" Claire said. "She's been asking questions," Helen said carefully. "About Pennsylvania, about the people you knew there, about your time as a schoolroom assistant." She looked at Clara directly. "Did you leave that position under any kind of... was there any kind of difficulty?" Clara met her eyes. "I was let go when they hired someone with a formal certificate. It was completely ordinary, and there was no dispute about it. Were there any complaints during your time there? Any parents who had concerns?" "There was one," Clara said. "A father who didn't think a woman without a husband should be teaching his sons. He complained to the school board. The board told him that was not a sufficient basis for dismissal, and he wrote a letter about it to the town newspaper." She paused. "I still have the board's decision in writing." Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She may have found the newspaper letter." Clara went still. "The father's letter," Helen said, "not the board's response. If she presents only the letter, a man's written complaint about your character, in print, without the context, without the board's ruling, without the explanation, it looks like a record of misconduct," Clara finished. Yes. Clara sat with this. She felt the particular cold clarity that comes when a threat becomes specific and visible. Not fear exactly, but the sharpening that happens when vague danger becomes something you can look at directly. "Does she have it?" Clara asked. "I don't know, but I think she's been trying to get it." Helen held her cup. "I'm telling you this because I think you should be prepared. And because..." She stopped. "Because?" Clara said. Helen looked at her with an expression Clara had not seen from her before, less appraising, more plainly honest. "Because I've watched what you've done here in 4 months, and I've watched how Ethan is, and I've been in this valley for 12 years, and I've watched Beatrice do what she does for 12 years, and I'm tired of watching her win." She said it quietly, without drama. "So tell me what I can do." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I need you to find out if she has the letter, not whether she has the newspaper, whether she has the actual issue, the physical paper." "I can do that," Helen said. "And if she does," Clara paused, thinking it through carefully. "I need you to get a message to Ida Hartley before the gathering." Helen nodded slowly. "What kind of message?" "I'll write it," Clara said. "I just need you to deliver it." The note she wrote to Ida that afternoon was 3 sentences long. She didn't tell Ethan what it said. She told him what she was planning, the broad shape of it, and he listened and said, "That's a risk." And she said yes, and he said okay, and that was the end of it. He trusted her. She was beginning, finally, to trust that he trusted her, which was a different thing from simply being trusted. Rose had taken over the evening cooking with an aptitude that surprised everyone except Clara, who had suspected it from the start. She made a venison stew that Jessie ate 3 bowls of, and even Rodrigo acknowledged with a nod of genuine appreciation, which was the Rodrigo equivalent of a standing ovation. The normalcy of a full table, the ordinary warmth of people eating together at the end of a hard day, Clara felt it that evening with a particular sharpness, the way you feel the good things more clearly when something difficult is approaching. After supper, Jessie asked her to check his reading. He'd been working through a county land survey document he'd found somewhere, either to practice or to be useful or both, in the way that Jessie did most things. She sat with him and they worked through it, and at a certain point he looked up and said, "You're not worried about the Holloway party?" She looked at him. "Why would I be worried?" "Pete said everyone's talking about it, that Mrs. Holloway invited you on purpose." "Pete talks too much," she said. "That's what Rodrigo says," Jessie agreed. "But Pete's usually right about the thing, even if he says too many words about it." She looked at the document they'd been reading. "Jessie, what do you think of when you think of this ranch? What's the first thing that comes to mind?" He thought about it seriously, the way he always thought about direct questions. "Home," he said. Then, slightly embarrassed, "I mean, I know it's not mine." "It is yours," she said. "You've worked here for 2 years. You've put your hands into this ground. That makes it yours in the way that matters." He looked at the document. "Is that what you think? About belonging to a place?" "I think belonging is something you build," she said. "It doesn't come with the territory. You have to make it." He was quiet. Then, "Have you made it here?" She looked around the room, the crooked mantel, the mismatched chairs, the shelf with its 3 books expanded now to 9, the tin coffee pot, the blue cloth over the window that she'd hemmed and rehung properly 2 months ago. "Yes," she said, "I think I have." Not. The Holloway gathering was on a Saturday. The house was large by Blackridge Valley standards. 2 full stories with a proper parlor and a dining room that could seat 30, and did, most of that number present when Clara and Ethan arrived. Fires in every fireplace, lamplight, women in good dresses and men in clean shirts, the accumulated social weight of a community's upper tier gathered in a room owned by the woman who had spent 4 months trying to erase Clara from it. They were received at the door by Harold, who shook Ethan's hand and nodded to Clara with the careful neutrality of a man who had made certain private decisions and was managing the consequences. Beatrice was across the room when they entered, speaking to the Sutton family, and she looked up and saw them and smiled with a precision that Clara had come to recognize as an expression that had nothing to do with what was underneath it. Ida Hartley was there. She caught Clara's eye from across the room and gave a small nod. Clara let out a breath she'd been holding since the wagon ride over. The evening moved the way these evenings moved, conversation and food and the social navigation of a room full of people who all knew each other in the specific layered way of people who've shared a geography for years. Clara talked to the Sutton family, who were warm in the uncomplicated way of people who respected practical competence and had seen it demonstrated. She talked to Ida. She talked to 2 women she'd never met, ranchers' wives from the north end of the valley who had heard about the water rights meeting secondhand and were curious about the woman at the center of it. She felt the room differently than she had at the first Holloway social, Less like a territory she was moving through carefully and more like a space she was simply in. Ethan stayed close without hovering, the way he'd promised. He talked to Sutton, to Harold briefly, to a man she didn't know who seemed to be discussing cattle breeding with the focused intensity of someone who found it genuinely interesting. She could see him from wherever she was in the room, and once, when she looked over, he was looking at her, and when their eyes met, something crossed his face. Not the small, contained, almost smile, but something fuller, something that he usually kept back, and he didn't look away quickly this time. She turned back to her conversation with a feeling that she wasn't going to be able to describe to anyone, not properly. Beatrice moved through the room like a hostess, attentive, gracious, managing the social temperature with the ease of long practice. She spoke to Clara twice in the first 2 hours, both times briefly, both times in the pleasant neutral register of a woman being perfectly correct. Clara matched her register precisely. They were like two people playing a game that everyone in the room could see, but that neither of them was going to name aloud. The moment came in the 3rd hour. The group had gathered naturally in the parlor after dinner, the larger cluster that happened when people were warm from food and fire and had run out of one-on-one conversations and collected into something communal. Beatrice moved to the center of it, with the specific movement of a woman who had always known how to hold a room, and she began to speak about the community, about the valley, about the importance of the families who had built it. Then, with the seamless ease of a skilled performer, she turned the conversation toward new arrivals. How lovely it was, she said, to see Blackridge Valley grow, to see new people find their way here. She looked at Clara while she said it, with the smile that meant something other than what it appeared to mean. And of course, she said, with the pleasant tone of someone doing a kindness, it's always important in a community like ours that we know who we're welcoming, that we can be certain of the character of those who join us. She paused. There's a wonderful thing about a small town, isn't there? The way information travels, the way we can learn about a person's history. Another pause, and her hand went to the table beside her where Clara now saw there was a folded newspaper. I happened to come across something quite interesting. Mrs. Holloway. It was Ida Hartley. Ida spoke from her position near the fireplace, in the clear, carrying voice of a woman who had spent 15 years projecting to the back of a schoolroom. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. The room went quiet the way it went quiet for teachers. Before you continue, Ida said, I'd like to share something with the room. If you'll permit me? Beatrice looked at her. Something shifted in her composure, not breaking, but adjusting, recalculating. Ida, she said pleasantly. Of course. Ida reached into the small bag she carried and produced a folded paper. 3 months ago, a man named Edwin Gorse wrote a letter to the Harbrook Courier complaining about a schoolroom assistant named Clara Whitmore. He objected to her employment on the grounds that she was unmarried. The letter was printed. She looked around the room. What was not printed was the school board's formal response, issued 1 week later, which found the complaint without merit, affirmed Mrs. Whitmore's, Miss Whitmore at the time, record of service as exemplary, and noted that the complaint reflected the complainant's personal prejudice rather than any professional failure. She held up the paper. This is a copy of that board decision. I obtained it last week from the Harbrook County Records Office. I taught school for 15 years, and I know how to find these things, and I know the difference between a complaint and a finding. She looked at Beatrice. I thought it was important that the full record be available. The room was very still. Clara did not look at Beatrice. She looked at Ethan, who was standing to her left, and he was looking back at her with an expression she understood completely, and it was not triumph. It was simpler than that, and more important. He was proud of her. Not because she'd won something, because of how. Beatrice stood with the folded newspaper on the table beside her and the full room in front of her, and the specific terrible exposure of a woman whose move has been anticipated and neutralized in public by a school teacher with a copy of a county document, and there was absolutely nothing she could say that would not make it worse. She folded her hands. How thorough of you, Ida, she said. Her voice was even. It was the most impressive thing Clara had ever watched her do. I try to be accurate, Ida said. The gathering continued. People found their way back into conversation. The newspaper on Beatrice's table sat where it was and no one touched it, and eventually a servant cleared it away with the rest of the evening's things. Harold Holloway caught Clara's eye once, across the room. He gave her a look that was complicated. Not quite respect, not quite acknowledgement. Something that contained both without fully committing to either. She gave him a small nod and moved on. Done. In the wagon on the way home, Ethan drove and Clara sat beside him, and they didn't speak for the first mile. The cold was sharp, and the stars were out, and the horses knew the road. Then Ethan said, "The note to Ida." "Yes," she said. "You told her about the newspaper letter." "I told her what to look for and where to look," she said. "She found it herself. She verified it herself. She decided herself to bring it." She looked at the road ahead. "I didn't manufacture anything. I just made sure the right person had the right information." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you know she might have the Harbrook paper?" "Helen told me she might. And once I knew what Beatrice was looking for, I could see the shape of what she intended to do with it." She paused. "The thing about a partial truth is that it only works if the rest of the truth isn't in the room." He turned to look at her, that proper look, the road being straight enough to allow it. "You're extraordinary," he said. She blinked. He didn't say things like that. He said things like that was good work, or you were right, or fair. He did not say extraordinary, unqualified, as a complete sentence. "I'm practical," she said, because she didn't know what else to do with it. "That's what makes you extraordinary," he said, and turned back to the road. She sat with that for the rest of the drive. Well, Rose had left a lamp burning and the stove warm, which Clara had not asked her to do, and which told her that Rose had made her own decisions about what this household needed. Jesse was asleep. Rodrigo's bunk was dark. The ranch was quiet in the particular way it was quiet at night. The sounds of animals settling, the wind off the north pasture, the slight creak of the house in the cold. Ethan put the horses up while Clara went inside and stood in the warm kitchen for a moment, just standing, letting the evening settle through her. She was thinking about Beatrice, not with triumph, not with satisfaction exactly, but with a kind of sober consideration. Beatrice was not finished. She knew that. A woman who had run a valley for 20 years did not reorganize her life around one bad evening. She would find another angle, another pressure point, another version of the same fundamental project. But something had changed tonight, and the change was not about Beatrice at all. The room had seen. Not just what Ida had done, not just what Clara had anticipated. The room had seen a woman who had been dismissed and gossiped about and lied about stand in the middle of a gathering and not defend herself with anger or tears or performance, but simply be prepared, be steady, be ready, and let the truth be sufficient. That was the thing you couldn't manufacture and couldn't take back once it happened. Ethan came in, shook the cold off his coat, hung it. "She's going to come at us again," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "I want us to be ready for it." "We will be," he said. He came and stood beside her at the stove, not touching, just close, the way he'd stood beside her in that first week when he was still figuring out the distance. Only the distance had changed now. It was smaller, not because either of them had crossed it all at once, but because every day of this strange, raw, real life they were building had worn it down a little. She leaned slightly against him. He shifted to accommodate it without making anything of it. Outside, the cold did what cold does. Inside, the stove held, and the lamp held, and the house held. And they stood there in the quiet kitchen of the ranch that was theirs, unfinished, imperfect, embattled, and entirely, stubbornly theirs. She thought about the frightened woman on the train with the photograph and the letter, and the decision. She thought, look where you are now. Not perfect, not safe, not settled, not done. But there. Still there. Beatrice Holloway made her final move in January. It came not as a social attack, not as a whisper campaign, not as a document produced at a gathering. It came as a legal filing. Ethan found out from Sutton, who heard it from the county clerk, who mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned it to Sutton's wife at the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Sutton had ridden out to the Callahan Ranch himself, which told Clara the matter was serious enough that he didn't want to let it travel by the usual channels and arrive distorted. He sat at their kitchen table with his hat in his hands and said, Harold Holloway has filed a challenge to the original land claim on your north section. Ethan went very still. On what grounds? Claire asked. Survey error, Sutton said. He's claiming the original boundary markers were placed incorrectly, that the North 40 actually falls outside what was legally filed, and therefore the water rights language in the survey doesn't apply to it the way you argued at the meeting. He looked at Ethan.
He's got a surveyor from the county seat coming out in 3 weeks to reassess. A surveyor Harold hired, Clara said. Yes. Ethan put his hands flat on the table, the same gesture she'd seen months ago when he'd come home from hearing what Marsh had said about her. Controlled anger looking for a container. Can he do that? She asked. Challenge a filing that's been registered for years? If he can show evidence of an original error, yes, Sutton said. It's not common, but it's legal. He paused. The thing is, if the boundary shifts the way he's claiming, it doesn't just affect the water rights. It affects the acreage. You'd lose about 12% of your productive land. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Rose was talking to Jessie about something near the barn, their voices carrying faint and ordinary through the cold air, completely unaware that in the kitchen, the shape of the ranch's future was shifting under everything. Thank you for coming yourself, Ethan said. You do the same, Sutton said, and put his hat on and left.
Clara sat with the problem the way she'd learned to sit with difficult things, not immediately, not with the first response that presented itself, but carefully, turning it over, looking at its underside. She thought about Beatrice, not with anger, with something closer to clarity. She thought about a woman who had spent 20 years deciding who belonged in a valley and who didn't, who had built her authority on the assumption that people would rather comply than resist, who had never encountered someone who simply would not be moved and so had kept escalating, each move larger than the last, until she had arrived at a legal filing that would cost her husband real money and real political capital and real credibility with the ranching community if it failed. That was the thing about escalation. At a certain point, it stopped being about the original target and started being about not being able to stop. She doesn't want the land, Clara said. Ethan looked at her from across the table. She wants us gone, Clara continued, or she wants to prove she can make us go. And because she can't make us go, she's going to make the ranch smaller and harder until she thinks we decide it's not worth it. She paused. But she's made a mistake. What mistake? She's put it in writing, Clara said. A legal filing is a public document. Whatever she claims about the boundary, she has to prove it. And if she can't prove it, the filing fails, and the record shows Harold Holloway brought a bad faith challenge against his neighbor's water rights claim. She looked at Ethan. The community will see that. Ethan was quiet for a moment. We need our own surveyor. Yes, she said. And we need him before Harold's man comes out. We need an independent assessment already in hand when that conversation happens. I know a man in Larimer County, Ethan said. He did the original work on the Sutton boundary 2 years ago. Fair, not connected to the Holloways. He stood. I'll ride out tomorrow. I'll come, she said. He looked at her. It's 2 days' ride. I know, she said. I'll come. He didn't argue. She'd learned that about him. He'd push back once to make sure she'd considered something, and if she said she'd considered it, he believed her. They left before dawn with 2 horses and enough provisions for 4 days, because 2 days there meant 2 days back, and Ethan said the weather could add time on the return. Rose would manage the ranch. Rodrigo would oversee. Jessie would handle the morning rounds with the seriousness of someone who understood he was being trusted with something real. Clara had watched Rodrigo speak to Jessie in the yard before they left. Low, direct, without ceremony. And Jessie had listened with his chin level and his expression focused, and she thought, 6 months ago he was a boy who apologized for taking up space. Now he stood in a conversation with a grown man and listened like someone who intended to be useful. She thought about what small things accumulated into. The ride was cold and the road was sometimes rough, and they stopped the first night at a way station that had a fire and a roof and not much else, and they ate from their own provisions and sat by the fire in the particular comfortable silence that had become the texture of their daily life together. Not empty silence, not avoidant silence, but the kind that meant there was nothing requiring words at this particular moment. Tell me about the first time you came west, she said. He looked at the fire. I was 19. Daniel was 17. We had $30 between us and a letter from a man who said he'd pay us to help drive cattle from Kansas to Wyoming. He paused. The man turned out to be considerably less organized than his letter suggested. The cattle drive took twice as long as planned. We got paid about half of what was promised. He almost smiled. But we saw the land. And that was enough? It was more than enough, he said. You have to understand, I grew up in Iowa, flat, managed, land that had been worked over for 40 years. And then you come out here and the land is just, it's not finished yet. It's still becoming something. And it felt like, he stopped. Like you could be part of what it became, Clara said. He looked at her. Yes. She understood that. She'd felt it on the wagon ride in, the first day. The sky asking her something she hadn't prepared for. She understood now that it wasn't asking her anything. It was offering. Just space. Just room. The thing she'd been looking for in every narrow city street where she'd never quite fit. I used to think I was looking for a place, she said. A specific place that would feel like mine. I'd be somewhere and think, maybe here. Maybe this is it. She looked at the fire. It was never the place. It was always whether there was someone in the place who saw me correctly. He was watching her. You see me correctly, she said, not as a compliment, as a statement of fact. I try to, he said. I don't always get it right. No, she said, but you try with the intention of getting it right. That's the thing that's rare. He looked at the fire for a long time. Then he said, I didn't know what I was asking for when I put that notice in the paper. I thought I was asking for help with the ranch. He paused. I got considerably more than that. So did I, she said. The surveyor's name was Caleb Morris, and he was a compact, precise man of about 60 who had the professional skepticism of someone who had spent 40 years measuring things other people argued about. He listened to Ethan's explanation without interrupting, asked 4 specific technical questions, and then said he could ride out to Black Ridge Valley in 5 days. I want to look at the original filing markers myself, he said, before I look at anything Holloway's man produces. I want my assessment independent. That's what we need, Clara said. He looked at her. You've read the original survey document. Yes, she said. The language on natural waterway rights. Yes. He studied her for a moment with the assessing look of a man whose profession was precision. The language is sound, he said. If the boundary markers are where they should be, the challenge fails on its face. He paused. So the question is whether Holloway genuinely believes there was a survey error, or whether he's manufactured a claim he knows won't hold. He knows it won't hold, Clara said. Morris looked at her for another moment. Then he said, 5 days, and wrote it in his book, and that was that. They rode home in weather that was worse than the ride out. A wind from the northwest that had teeth in it, and a stretch of road on the second day that had iced overnight and required slow, careful movement that doubled the time. Clara's hands went numb twice, and she wore the heavier gloves without being told, and Ethan didn't say anything about it, which was its own kind of communication. They made it back the evening of the 4th day. Rose had supper on, and the stove at full heat, and the lamp in the window, and Jessie practically vibrated with the effort of not immediately telling them everything that had happened in their absence until they'd had a chance to sit down and eat. Then he told them, one of the south fence posts had split in the cold. He and Rodrigo had replaced it. The mare had been favoring her healed leg in the morning cold, but was fine by afternoon. A man had ridden by and asked for Ethan, and Rodrigo had told him Ethan was away, and he'd left without leaving his name. What did he look like? Clara asked. Jessie described him. She didn't recognize the description, but the timing, a stranger asking for Ethan during the days she and Ethan were specifically away, sat wrong. Holloway's man, Ethan said quietly, when Jessie had gone to clean up. Maybe, she said, seeing if we were gone, seeing how the ranch ran without us. She looked at him. It runs fine. He nodded. I know it does. Caleb Morris arrived as promised, 5 days later, and spent a full day walking the north section of the Callahan property with his equipment and his notebook and the original survey filing, which Clara had retrieved from the tin box and handed to him with the care of someone who understood what it was worth. He didn't talk while he worked. Clara didn't follow him. She watched from a distance, the way she'd learned to watch things, and let him do what he did. By late afternoon, he came back to the house and sat at the table and opened his notebook and said, "The original markers are exactly where they should be. The survey was done correctly. The boundary is accurate." He looked at his notes. Whatever Holloway's surveyor tells him, he will be telling him something that is not supported by the physical evidence on the ground, which I have now documented in detail. He closed the notebook. "I'll produce a formal written assessment, signed and stamped." "How long?" Ethan asked. "A week," Morris said. "I'll send it to the county records office as well, so there's an independent document on file before the challenge hearing." "Thank you," Clara said. He looked at her with the same direct assessment he'd given her in Larimer County. "The challenge will fail," he said. "A bad faith land claim leaves a mark on the record. Harold Holloway is a practical man. He'll see that when the assessment lands, and he'll withdraw." He paused. Whether he had a choice in filing it in the first place is a different question. He said it without elaboration, but the meaning was clear. Clara thanked him again, and Ethan paid him, and he rode out into the late afternoon light, and Clara and Ethan stood in the yard and watched him go, and for the first time in the week since Sutton had arrived with the news of the filing, something in Clara's chest unknotted. Not all the way, but enough. "She overplayed it," Ethan said. "Yes," Clara said. "She finally overplayed it." Bum. Morse's assessment arrived at the county office in 8 days. Harold Holloway withdrew the challenge within 48 hours of its filing. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no scene. Harold sent a brief written notice to the county clerk, and that was the end of it, as quietly as it had begun, except that a legal challenge to a neighbor's land rights was now part of the public record, and the valley knew it, and the valley made its own assessments without being asked. Sutton came by 2 days later and said, "3 ranchers on the east side have been talking about Holloway's land practices more generally. Apparently this wasn't the first time he's tried something like this. There was a boundary dispute with the Kellerman family 4 years ago that got resolved quietly because Kellerman didn't have the resources to fight it." He looked at Ethan. "They're talking about taking that to the council." "That's their decision to make," Ethan said. "Yes," Sutton said, "but I thought you should know that what you did, what you both did, it didn't just protect your property. It gave other people a way to see something they'd been looking at wrong." He paused, plainly uncomfortable with the length of the speech, but committed to finishing it. "That matters." He left. Clara and Ethan looked at each other across the yard. "We didn't set out to do any of that," she said. "No," he said. "We just didn't leave." She thought about that for a long time afterward. The strange, accumulating power of simply not leaving. Not fighting, not performing, not making speeches, just staying, doing the work, being present and honest and prepared, and letting that be enough. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that made a good story when you compressed it, but lived from the inside day by day. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. She thought about the woman on the train who had told herself she was being practical, making a decision instead of waiting for one to be made for her. That woman had been right, but she hadn't understood the full scope of what she was deciding. She'd thought she was deciding about a ranch, and a man she'd never met. She hadn't known she was deciding about herself, about whether she believed, down in the part of herself that didn't negotiate, that she had the right to take up space in the world. She hadn't been sure then. She was sure now. Us. Spring came slowly, as it always does in that part of the country, grudgingly, in fits, cold mornings giving way to warm afternoons that had no intention of committing to anything. But by April, the ground had thawed enough, and Ethan started the porch. He'd bought the lumber in March, stacking it in the barn against the thaw with the focused, forward-leaning energy of someone who had made a promise and was keeping it. On the first real working day of April, he was out before breakfast with his tools, and Clara brought him coffee and found him crouched over the foundation boards with a level and an expression of concentrated intent. First thing, she said. He looked up. First thing, he said. Jesse helped. Rodrigo helped in his way, which meant he appeared at useful moments with the correct piece of equipment and said nothing about it. Rose watched from the kitchen doorway and eventually came out and held boards while they were cut with a calm practicality that had by now become simply who she was at the Callahan Ranch, the way everyone there had become simply who they were. The porch took 3 weekends. It was not perfect. One end sat 2 inches lower than the other because of how the ground ran, and Ethan spent an afternoon trying to correct it before Clara told him it was fine, that a porch that sat slightly tilted on honest ground was more itself than one forced into a precision it didn't have the foundation for. He gave her a look. She gave him one back. He put down the level. The first evening they sat on it, in 2 chairs that Ethan had bought from a man in town who made furniture in his back room. The sun was going down in the particular extravagant way it went down out here. Too much color, almost excessive, the sky not knowing when to stop. Clara had a cup of coffee. Ethan had his hands folded over his knee. The ranch spread out before them, the barn and the paddock and the pasture beyond. The fence line running north toward the section where the boundary markers stood exactly where they had always stood. I want to write to the Women's Placement Agency in the spring, Clara said. He looked at her. About what? There are women going through that agency who end up in bad situations, she said. Men who misrepresent themselves, towns where there's no support, arrangements that go wrong and leave a woman with nothing. She looked out at the yard. I have some experience with arriving somewhere unknown, and some experience with making something of it, and I think I could offer, not advice exactly, just honesty, about what to look for, what questions to ask. She paused. Ida thinks it could be a column in the Valley paper, short, practical. He thought about this. Ida's on board? She brought it up herself, Clara said, after the Holloway gathering. She said she'd been thinking about it. He was quiet for a moment. It'll put you in the public eye more. The column. I know, she said. Beatrice won't like it. I know that too, she said. And then, because she thought it needed saying, Beatrice is going to be here. She's not going anywhere, neither are we, and at some point that just becomes the condition of things. She doesn't like me. She may never like me. But she stopped being able to do anything about it, and I think eventually she'll put her energy somewhere else. She looked at him. People like that need a project. If we stop being a project worth having, she'll find another one. He thought about this for a long time. You might be right, he said finally. I'm often right, she said. You are, he said without hesitation. She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been looking at him since the first days when she was learning him in pieces. She knew him now. Not completely. She didn't think you ever knew anyone completely, and she'd stopped believing that was the goal. But she knew the shape of him, the square jaw and the tired eyes that weren't as tired as they'd been, the fair, stubborn decency that he sometimes failed to live up to and never stopped trying to, the way he held things, his grief, his hope, his love, all of it close and careful, like a man who'd learned that held things were more likely to last. She thought about something Helen Pratt had said to her once, in passing. I'm not sure most people know what they're building until after they've built it. She thought that was probably true. She'd come west looking for a door that hadn't closed yet, and what she'd found that she was the one who had to build the door, and the house behind it, and the porch to sit on and look out from at the end of the day. She'd found that belonging wasn't given, it was made. Made from the unglamorous daily business of showing up and doing what needed doing and being honest about what you didn't know, and staying when staying was harder than leaving. Made from survey documents and injured animals and kitchen tables, and the courage required to stand in a room full of people who had decided about you and refused to be what they'd decided. She had made it. They had made it. That summer, the column appeared for the first time in the Black Ridge Valley Courier. 6 inches of clean, practical prose under the heading, For Women Traveling West, by Clara Callahan. No flourish, no sentiment, just honest information about water rights and supply costs and what questions to ask a man before you agreed to marry him, and what to do if you arrived somewhere and found the situation was different from what you'd been told. Ida had suggested the heading. Clara had written the rest. The response came in letters, which Ida collected and brought to the ranch on her weekly ride out. She'd taken to coming on Thursdays, staying for supper, which had become a standing arrangement that nobody had formally proposed, and everyone had simply adopted. Letters from women in other valleys, women in other territories, women who had read the column in copies of the paper that traveled with merchants and supply wagons and the general slow drift of print across the frontier. Most of the letters said some version of the same thing. I didn't know anyone had thought about this before. I didn't know anyone thought about us. She kept them in a box. The ranch grew, not dramatically. This was not the kind of land or the kind of operation that transformed overnight, but steadily, with the solidity of things built correctly on honest ground. The Sutton arrangement paid out well through the summer. 2 other ranching families came to Ethan with arrangements of their own, referrals from Sutton, and those were negotiated at the kitchen table with Claire's pen checking the language and Ethan's handshake closing the deal. Rose Finney was still there. She had moved, by the fall, into a wage arrangement in a proper room that Ethan and Jesse had built out from the storage space, small, but hers with a window. She was talking to a young man from the north end of the valley who came around on weekends with transparent enthusiasm and brought things he claimed to have extra of, which no one had asked for and everyone appreciated. Clara watched Rose navigate it with the measured, open-eyed assessment of a woman who had learned what questions to ask before she committed to anything and was quietly proud of something she couldn't take credit for. Jesse turned 16 in August. Ethan gave him a proper wage and a handshake, which Jesse received with a dignity slightly undermined by the way his face did something complicated for a moment before he got it back under control. "You've earned it," Ethan said. Jesse said, "Thank you," very carefully, like he was trusting the 2 words to carry more than they usually did. They did. Beatrice Holloway attended the harvest gathering in September and was civil to Clara with the specific civility of a woman who had accepted a territorial line and was not going to cross it, which was not warmth and not friendship, but was a kind of peace that Clara thought was probably the best available version of the outcome, and she took it for what it was. Harold, across the room, caught her eye as he often did at these things, with that complicated look. Not quite respect, not quite acknowledgement. She thought she understood him better now. A man who had spent 20 years trying to redirect a force of nature and had finally found the thing that redirected it for him. She didn't know what it had cost him in private. She suspected it was more than it looked. She nodded at him. He nodded back. That was that. On a night in October, late, when the ranch was quiet and the fire was low and Ethan was already asleep, Clara sat on the new porch alone in the cold with a blanket around her shoulders and looked out at the dark land. She was thinking about the woman who had stepped off the train at Black Ridge Valley, frightened and composed, carrying a suitcase and a photograph and a letter that promised a door that might or might not be real. She thought about what that woman had not known. She hadn't known about survey documents or water rights or the particular look Ethan got when he was proud of her and didn't know how to say so directly. She hadn't known about Jesse's reading or Rose's stew or Rodrigo's coffee or the way the sky went extravagant at sunset over land that was yours. She hadn't known that belonging was not a feeling that arrived. It was a practice, a daily, imperfect, unglamorous practice of choosing to be where you were and doing what the day required, and staying when every frightened part of you said leaving would be easier. She wasn't a different person than the woman who had stepped off that train. She recognized her completely. The carefulness, the self-containment, the determination to not need anyone so much that losing them would undo her. Those things were still there. She just stopped mistaking them for her whole self. Her whole self included this: the porch, the tilted end that sat on honest ground, the man inside who held things carefully because held things lasted, the ranch that was unfinished in the way that living things are always unfinished, not broken, just still becoming. She thought about what she would say if she could say something to the women who wrote letters to her column. She thought about what was actually true, underneath all the practical advice about water rights and contract language and questions to ask before you said yes. She thought the true thing was this: you do not travel to find a place. You travel to find out whether you are someone who can build one. And the answer, for most people who are willing to do the work, is yes. It is almost always yes. But you have to stay long enough to find out. You have to stay. The cold settled around her, familiar now. The stars were out in their careless abundance. Somewhere in the north pasture, one of the cattle made a sound and then was quiet. She pulled the blanket tighter and sat there a little longer in the dark, on the porch she had insisted on, and the land she had helped defend, and the life she had not been given but had made, piece by imperfect piece, with her own two hands. Then she went inside. She went where it was warm,